The silence inside the mansion feels almost unnatural. Sunlight stretches across polished floors that look untouched, the kind of quiet that usually belongs to places meant to represent success. For Tammy Slaton, this house was never just a luxury property or a television show trophy. It was something far more personal. After years of public struggles, health battles, and moments when even her own family feared the worst, the mansion represented proof that her life had finally changed. Every room symbolized survival, independence, and a future she once thought might never come. But now, that symbol of independence has become the center of a shocking family controversy. Because according to Tammy, something may have happened behind the scenes involving documents tied to the property. Documents that suggest the ownership structure of the mansion may have changed during a time when she was unable to manage her affairs. And the person she believes might be connected to those changes? Her own sister, Amy Slaton. For longtime fans of 1000 LB Sisters, the accusation feels almost impossible to believe. For years, viewers watched Tammy and Amy support each other through their darkest moments. Amy was the sister who drove Tammy to appointments, defended her online, and stood beside her during hospital stays when the future looked uncertain. Their relationship was messy, emotional, and sometimes chaotic. But beneath all of it, there always seemed to be loyalty. Now that loyalty is being questioned, and the deeper the story goes, the more complicated the truth appears to become. Because what started as a simple question about paperwork has quickly turned into something much bigger, a dispute involving legal authority, financial decisions, and the possibility that a family bond may have been pushed to its breaking point. So what really happened with Tammy's mansion? Did a misunderstanding spiral out of control, or is there something more serious behind the scenes? Let's break down the timeline, the documents, and the growing tension that has fans completely divided. The quiet inside the mansion feels almost unnatural. Sunlight spills across polished floors that look untouched, the kind of silence that only exists in places that are supposed to. Symbolize success. For Tammy Slaton, this house was not simply a piece of property or a luxury purchase meant to impress strangers on television. It was proof that a life once defined by struggle had finally begun to change. Every room carried a reminder that she had survived years of public humiliation, health crises, and moments when even the people closest to her wondered if she would ever truly stand on her own. That is why the accusation that suddenly surfaced shocked so many people who had followed the Slaton sisters for years. According to Tammy, something had happened behind the scenes involving documents connected to the mansion, documents that suggested the ownership structure of the property might have been altered. The detail that made the situation even more unsettling was the person she believed might be responsible. Her own sister Amy. The moment the allegation appeared, it created a ripple of disbelief. For years, viewers had watched Amy support Tammy through the darkest periods of her life. Amy had been the sister who drove hours to medical appointments, who sat beside hospital beds when doctors spoke in uncertain tones, who defended Tammy when criticism from strangers online turned cruel. Their relationship had always looked chaotic yet strangely loyal, the kind of messy bond that families often share when life forces them to depend on each other. Now that same relationship stood under a cloud of suspicion. Tammy's voice, when she first described the situation, carried something heavier than anger. She sounded tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing a problem may have been forming long before you noticed it. She explained that several months earlier she had begun seeing small irregularities connected to financial paperwork linked to the mansion. At first, those irregularities seemed harmless enough to ignore. A notification from an advisor. That did not match her memory of a meeting, a document she did not remember signing. Minor inconsistencies that might easily be explained as clerical mistakes. But the inconsistencies did not disappear. Instead, they began forming a pattern. The deeper Tammy looked into the records, the more uneasy she became. Certain entries suggested that changes had been made to the legal structure connected to the property. Percentages of ownership appeared to have shifted. Maintenance contracts seemed to be tied to different authorizations, and payments were routed through channels Tammy did not remember approving. None of these details by themselves proved anything suspicious. Yet, together, they created a question that refused to fade. Who had the authority to make those changes? And why had she not been fully aware of them? The mansion itself had always represented something deeply personal for Tammy. Long before fame or television contracts entered the picture, her life had been defined by dependence. She relied on family members for transportation, for medical support, sometimes even for the simplest tasks that most people take for granted. The journey toward independence had taken years of painful effort. Losing weight had been only part of the transformation. The more difficult change came from learning how to manage her own decisions and finances without leaning on others. That house stood as the clearest symbol of that new independence. Every hallway and every piece of furniture represented a life she had built through persistence and stubborn determination. The idea that control of that symbol might have shifted without her full awareness felt less like a paperwork error and more like a violation of the progress she had fought to achieve. The moment she allowed herself to consider the possibility that someone close to her might be involved, the emotional weight became even harder to ignore. Tammy and Amy had spent most of their lives sharing not only family memories, but also a public identity. When their reality show first appeared, viewers did not tune in simply to watch weight loss journeys. They watched because the sisters felt genuine. Their conversations were often chaotic and unfiltered, yet there was always a sense that beneath the arguments existed an unbreakable bond. Amy had often been portrayed as the protective one, while Tammy struggled with health setbacks. Amy pushed forward with her own surgery and personal milestones. She tried to motivate her sister while balancing motherhood and a growing spotlight from television cameras. Their dynamics sometimes resembled a caregiver and patient more than two adults, navigating life side by side. Over time, that dynamic began to shift. As Tammy's health improved, she gradually stepped into a more independent role. She began speaking about investments, business opportunities, and the importance of controlling her own financial future. The transformation surprised many people who had once doubted whether she would ever gain that level of confidence. Suddenly, she was discussing property, ownership, and brand partnerships rather than hospital visits and recovery programs. That shift changed the balance between the sisters in ways that were not always visible on camera. For the first time, Tammy was not the family member who needed constant supervision. She was making decisions that placed her firmly in control of her own life. The mansion represented the culmination of that transformation, a place that proved she was capable of building something stable after years of uncertainty. When questions about the property documents surfaced, Tammy initially assumed the situation could be explained by professional advisors handling paperwork behind the scenes. Financial structures often become complicated when television personalities begin working with accountants and lawyers. It would not have been unusual for adjustments to appear in legal files without immediately catching her attention, but the explanation that finally reached her from a financial advisor carried a tone that felt different. The advisor informed Tammy that certain revisions linked to the property had been processed during a time when she had been hospitalized for a medical procedure. The revisions appeared legitimate on the surface, yet they had been authorized through a chain of access that Tammy did not remember establishing herself. The detail that disturbed her most was the mention of temporary authority over some financial records during that medical emergency. That authority had reportedly been connected to Amy. At first, Tammy struggled to believe the implication. Amy had been the person she trusted most during difficult moments. When health crises forced Tammy to step away from daily responsibilities, Amy had often helped coordinate practical matters such as bills or communication with doctors. The idea that such assistance might somehow intersect with property ownership felt almost impossible to accept. Still, the paperwork existed. Documents suggested that discussions regarding the mansion had taken place while Tammy was recovering from surgery. Signatures appeared on authorizations connected to the property. Some of those signatures were hers, though the context surrounding them remained unclear. Whether those documents had been fully explained to her at the time became the central question that would soon divide the family. When the issue finally surfaced during a family gathering, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Amy arrived with the same fast-paced humor she had displayed for years. Her sarcasm often served as a shield during uncomfortable conversations, and many people expected the evening to follow the usual rhythm of teasing and chaotic laughter. Instead, Tammy sat, quietly watching her sister with an expression that felt unusually controlled. Chris remained silent longer than usual, while Amanda studied the room with cautious attention. The tension seemed to grow heavier with each passing second until Tammy finally spoke. Her words were direct. She believed the ownership of her mansion had been changed, and the person connected to the documents was Amy. For a moment, Amy reacted the way many people do when confronted with something that sounds too strange to be real. She laughed. The reaction carried the energy of disbelief, rather than mockery, yet the laughter faded quickly when she realized Tammy was not joking. Tammy's expression never softened. She explained that legal advisors were already reviewing the documents and that the situation appeared far more serious than a misunderstanding. According to Tammy, the changes had been initiated without her full awareness. She insisted that the process looked less like routine restructuring and more like a transfer of authority. The room fell silent. Amy attempted to respond by explaining that the situation involved financial restructuring, designed to protect assets during a complicated period. She insisted that decisions had been made quickly while Tammy faced medical complications and that the intention had never been to take control away from her. Tammy listened carefully before responding with a sentence that lingered long after the conversation ended. "You do not protect someone by selling what they built." That line captured the emotional heart of the conflict. The issue was no longer simply about legal paperwork. It had become a question of trust between two sisters who had spent years supporting each other through public struggles. Amy tried to defend herself by pointing out the sacrifices she had made during Tammy's health battles. She reminded everyone that she had been present during hospital stays and recovery programs when Tammy could barely stand on her own. Those memories carried genuine weight because they reflected the truth of their shared history. Yet Tammy remained focused on the documents. For her, the core issue was not whether Amy had once helped her survive difficult moments. The issue was whether the authority granted during those moments had been used in ways that crossed a line she never intended to permit. As the evening unfolded, the argument began to feel less like a family disagreement and more like a dispute between business partners. Conversations about signatures and authorization replaced the usual jokes and sarcasm. Chris attempted to calm the discussion, while Amanda questioned why financial decisions had been handled privately instead of involving the entire family. The tension reached a point where no one seemed certain how to move forward. What had started as a quiet concern about paperwork had now transformed into something that threatened to fracture the Slaton family completely. And the deeper Tammy looked into the situation, the more complicated the truth appeared to become. The days that followed did not bring clarity. Instead, they created more questions. And those questions slowly began spreading beyond the walls of the Slaton family. Tammy could not stop thinking about the timeline connected to the mansion documents. The more she reviewed the details with her advisors, the more unsettling the sequence of events appeared. Certain paperwork had been processed during the exact period when she had been physically unable to monitor her own affairs. While she was recovering from surgery and focusing on survival, conversations about the future of her property had quietly taken place in offices she had never entered. To Tammy, the realization felt deeply personal. She had spent years fighting to reach a place where she could stand independently. Every milestone had required enormous effort, The surgery that saved her life had not been a simple transformation story for television. It had been the result of discipline, painful, setbacks, and a constant struggle against habits that once controlled her life. When the mansion was finally purchased, it symbolized more than success. It represented control over a future she once believed she might never experience. Now the possibility that decisions about that future might have been made without her. Knowledge forced her to confront a difficult thought. If someone she trusted had acted without her consent, the betrayal would reach far beyond financial loss. Meanwhile, Amy was dealing with a completely different storm of emotions. From her perspective, the situation looked less like deception and more like chaos that had spiraled out of control. She remembered the period when Tammy had been hospitalized as one of the most stressful chapters of their lives. Medical decisions arrived quickly, and the family often had to react without warning. Bills accumulated while everyone focused on keeping Tammy alive. Amy had stepped forward during that period because someone needed to manage the practical details. She had communicated with advisors, handled certain financial responsibilities, and tried to prevent complications that could have worsened Tammy's recovery. In Amy's mind, the decisions she made had always been about protecting the stability of the family's growing business and the property connected to it. The possibility that those actions were now being interpreted as manipulation left her feeling cornered. Amy insisted that no secret plan existed to take control of Tammy's mansion. According to her, the discussions about restructuring property ownership were connected to financial planning strategies suggested by professionals who believed adjustments might help reduce long-term risks. However, one detail continued to complicate her explanation. When her own attorney asked whether Tammy had clearly approved every step of that restructuring process, Amy hesitated. The hesitation did not automatically prove wrongdoing, yet it introduced uncertainty into a situation that already carried enormous emotional weight. Tammy's legal team began examining the paperwork line by line. They looked at signatures and timestamps while trying to understand whether the documents reflected informed consent or temporary authority granted during a medical emergency. The distinction mattered enormously. If Amy had acted under legitimate power of attorney, the changes might fall within legal boundaries. If that authority had been stretched beyond its intended purpose, the consequences could become much more serious. Tammy listened quietly during those meetings. Her reactions remained controlled, but the tension was visible in her posture. The lawyers explained that the property transfer did not necessarily mean the mansion had already been sold. Instead, the structure of ownership had shifted in ways that allowed negotiations with potential buyers to begin. The idea that strangers might have been discussing the sale of her home before she fully understood the situation made Tammy feel as though her life had briefly moved forward. Without her permission, during one conversation with her attorney, she admitted something that revealed the depth of the emotional wound. She said the situation made her feel used. The word hung in the air long after she spoke it. For Tammy, that feeling overshadowed the technical details of contracts and legal authority. Whether the documents ultimately proved legal or questionable, the damage to her sense of trust had already begun. Outside the legal offices, the public reaction was growing louder. Fans of the reality series began examining every fragment of information connected to the controversy. Screenshots of property records circulated across social media platforms while viewers debated what the documents might mean. Some people defended Amy passionately, pointing out that she had spent years sacrificing her own time to support Tammy's health journey. Others believed Tammy's emotional reaction suggested something far more troubling had occurred behind the scenes. Within hours, the discussion transformed into a digital investigation. Commentators analyzed the timeline of Tammy's hospitalization and the dates attached to the property revisions. Some viewers claimed the documents looked suspicious, while others argued that financial restructuring often appears confusing even when nothing illegal has occurred. The internet became a courtroom filled with opinions rather than evidence. While strangers debated the details online, the Slaton family faced a more painful reality. Inside their own homes, the tension between Tammy and Amy began affecting every conversation. Phone calls that once felt casual now carried awkward pauses. Even family members who tried to remain neutral found themselves pulled into the emotional gravity of the conflict. Chris attempted to create space for dialogue before the situation became irreversible. He arranged a private meeting, hoping the sisters could discuss the issue without cameras or public speculation influencing their words. When Tammy arrived, she looked composed yet distant. Amy appeared equally tense, her usual quick humor replaced by a quiet seriousness that revealed how deeply the situation had shaken her confidence. Chris spoke first. He reminded both sisters of their earliest years together when fame had not yet complicated their lives. Back then, they filmed simple videos in small apartments while sharing the same hopes about improving their future. Their success had come slowly and often painfully, built on the willingness to show their most vulnerable moments to millions of viewers. Money had not been the reason they started that journey. Yet money had become an unavoidable part of their reality once the show gained popularity. As brand deals expanded and business opportunities multiplied, the sisters began working with separate advisors who managed different aspects of their careers. What once operated as a shared enterprise gradually evolved into individual ventures. That separation allowed each sister to pursue her own ambitions, but it also introduced layers of financial complexity that none of them had fully anticipated. Chris asked a question that forced both women to confront the heart of the problem. How did money get between you like this? Neither Tammy nor Amy answered immediately. The silence revealed how far their relationship had drifted from the simplicity of their earlier years. Trust that once felt automatic now required explanations supported by legal documents. Amy finally spoke. She explained again that during Tammy's hospitalization, she believed she was protecting the family's financial stability. Bills related to medical treatment were enormous, and advisors warned that failing to restructure certain assets might create long-term complications. According to Amy, she had trusted the guidance she received from professionals who assured her that temporary adjustments could later be reversed once Tammy recovered. Tammy listened without interrupting. When Amy finished, Tammy responded calmly but firmly. She said the problem was not simply the decisions Amy made, but the fact that those decisions had been made without a clear conversation between them. For Tammy, independence meant having the ability to choose how her property and finances were handled. If someone else had exercised that authority without fully explaining the consequences, it felt like the independence she fought so hard to achieve had briefly been taken away. Amy's eyes filled with frustration. She insisted that every step she took was motivated by concern for Tammy's well-being. The thought that her actions were now being interpreted as betrayal hurt deeply. Yet she also recognized that the legal complexity surrounding the documents made the situation difficult to explain in simple terms. The conversation moved in circles. Every attempt to clarify the events seemed to reveal another layer of confusion. By the time the meeting ended, neither sister felt satisfied with the answers they had exchanged. Outside the room, the larger implications of the dispute continued growing. Entertainment reporters began describing the situation as one of the most serious conflicts the reality series had ever faced. Earlier seasons focused primarily on health struggles and personal growth. Now the story involved property ownership, legal authority, and the possibility that family trust had collapsed under the pressure of financial success. The mansion that once symbolized Tammy's independence now represented something far more complicated. For some observers, it became evidence that the sisters' fame had created opportunities they were not fully prepared to manage. Contracts, advisors, and investment strategies entered their lives quickly once television exposure expanded their income. Navigating those Complexities required expertise that neither sister possessed during the early stages of their career. Success had given them resources, yet it also introduced risks. If those risks were not carefully explained, they could easily produce misunderstandings large, enough to damage even the strongest relationships. Tammy returned to the mansion late one evening after another meeting with her attorneys. The house felt different than it had before the controversy began. Walking through the quiet rooms, she passed photographs that captured happier memories. Family gatherings filled with laughter, holidays where the sisters celebrated milestones they once believed impossible. She stopped beside a large window overlooking the property. For several minutes, she remained silent while the landscape outside faded slowly into evening shadows. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a mixture of pride and sorrow. She said she had fought too hard for this life to let confusion destroy it. Whether the legal investigation would confirm her suspicions remained uncertain. What she understood clearly was that the relationship with Amy could never return to the uncomplicated trust they once shared unless the truth behind the documents was fully revealed. Across town, Amy faced the same uncertainty from a different angle. She knew the decisions made during Tammy's hospitalization would now be examined by lawyers and possibly by investigators if the situation escalated further. The possibility that her intentions might be misinterpreted as criminal behavior filled her with dread. Yet, she also realized that some questions raised by Tammy could not be ignored. If she had acted too quickly under pressure without ensuring Tammy fully understood the implications, the consequences might extend far beyond a family argument. As the weeks passed, both sisters waited for answers that would determine the future of their relationship and perhaps the future of the show that had brought them fame. The mansion remained standing quietly in the background of the controversy, no longer just a symbol of achievement, but a reminder of how fragile trust can become when money and responsibility collide. The longer the investigation continued, the clearer one reality became. What once looked like a confusing family disagreement was beginning to resemble something much more serious. Tammy's legal team had started mapping the entire chain of events connected to the mansion. Every document was examined with careful attention. Signatures were compared against previous records. Financial activity linked to the property was reviewed month by month to understand exactly when changes had occurred. What they discovered did not immediately prove a crime, yet it revealed a complicated sequence of decisions that raised even more questions. Some of the property revisions had been processed during a narrow period when Tammy was physically unable to handle her own affairs. That fact alone did not indicate wrongdoing, because temporary authority is sometimes granted during medical emergencies. However, the scale of the changes surrounding the mansion went beyond what many people would expect from routine management. The house had not only been maintained or refinanced, at one point it had quietly entered early stages of potential sale negotiations. Tammy struggled to understand how conversations about selling the place she considered her personal sanctuary could have begun without her direct involvement. The idea that potential buyers might have been discussing offers while she recovered from surgery left her feeling as though pieces of her life had been moving forward without her knowledge. Her lawyer explained that the negotiations never reached a finalized sale. The dispute between the sisters had effectively frozen the process before anything irreversible occurred. Yet the fact that the property reached that stage meant that several people had believed they possessed the authority to move the transaction forward. That authority appeared to trace back to the temporary control established during Tammy's hospitalization. The question now was whether that control had been exercised within the boundaries Tammy intended, or whether those boundaries had quietly been crossed. While Tammy reviewed documents with her legal team, Amy was meeting with her own advisors who were attempting to understand the same timeline from a different perspective. Amy insisted repeatedly that no hidden scheme existed. She believed she had acted responsibly during a moment when Tammy's health crisis forced quick decisions. Medical bills had been enormous, and property maintenance costs were increasing rapidly. Advisors had warned that leaving large assets untouched during a financial emergency could expose Tammy to unnecessary risk. According to Amy, the discussions about restructuring ownership were meant to provide flexibility rather than permanent control. Yet, the deeper her lawyers looked into the paperwork, the more they realized how fragile that explanation might sound under intense scrutiny. One of the attorneys carefully pointed out that good intentions do not always protect someone from legal consequences. If the authority granted during Tammy's medical crisis was interpreted too broadly by someone managing those decisions, the situation could easily be viewed as overreach. Amy sat quietly absorbing the implication. For the first time, she began considering a possibility she had previously pushed aside. Even if she believed she had been helping Tammy, the legal interpretation of those actions might look very different. Meanwhile, the public fascination surrounding the conflict continued expanding,